Hello, thank you very much for joining us. I am Dr. Vanda Felbab-Brown, the director of the Initiative on Nonstate Armed Actors at the Brookings Institution, where I'm also senior fellow. And I'm delighted that you are joining us today for a conversation with a stellar panel on the situation in Myanmar. What is happening with the civil war in the country? What are the prospects for getting out of the civil war? Over 2 years ago, a military coup in Myanmar ended the democratic transition on which the country had been embarked for a decade, after decades of prior authoritarianism. Yet the military has, yet in consequence of elections, the military mounted a coup d'etat and ended the democratic process. And since then, has, however, encountered a surprisingly effective, if under-resourced, armed resistance in both rural and urban parts of the country, and not just in the ethnic minority areas that had long been a center of fighting and insurgency. In fact, for decades have been places of fighting and insurgency, but also in the Bamar areas, the areas where the country's ethnic majority lives. That conflict has been intensifying and become increasingly violent, including as the Myanmar military is responding with greater and greater brutality, including against civilians. Even so, the junta has not been able to extinguish the armed groups and the resistance groups. At the same time, neither the anti-junta resistance group nor the ethnic armed groups, the two set of armed actors in the country, are anywhere close to defeating the junta either. And so some of the issues that we are going to be exploring is what are the prospects for sustaining conflict? Will there be any change if the junta holds any kind of elections, however credible or not? What are the historic tensions, rivalries, relationship between the national unity government led by the NLD, as well as between the ethnic armed groups and the resistant groups? And of course, there are other issues that continue ongoing in the country that are getting less exposure, but nonetheless remain very significant, such as the fate of the Rohingyas. Moreover, overlaying the violent conflict and issues of political transitions and political relations, and intersecting with sustainability of the armed struggle and sustainability of any kind of ceasefires, are illegal economies. For decades, these illegal economies in heroin, methamphetamine, wildlife trafficking, illegal logging, mining, and increasingly now also issues of forced labor in casinos have fueled the conflict, but they also enabled and sometimes underpinned ceasefire arrangements. A wide variety of actors have participated in them, the ethnic armed organizations, pro-government militias, various cronies of the junta and its military corporations, as well as Chinese criminal groups. So what is happening with these various illegal economies and what role they'll play in the conflict and any kind of transition out of the conflict today is another important theme we'll be looking at. And finally, the conflict in Myanmar is not just a local civil war conflict. It intersects with the regional and geopolitical dimensions also. Russia has been providing arms to the junta, and India has supported the junta with both arms and diplomacy, while China's posture has remained more understated. Although condemning the coup and imposing sanctions on the Myanmar military, the West has not provided the armed resistance with military or financial assistance it seeks. And yet just recently, there was a strong op-ed by the former US ambassador to Myanmar, Scott Marciel, calling for moving toward a much more forward-leaning posture of the United States including providing much more significant assistance to the national unity government and the resistant groups. Yet that is fraught with very many issues. So yet another topic we'll be looking at. And for unpacking these various issues and giving us an intimate picture of what's happening on the ground, I am absolutely delighted to have a stellar set of panelists. Really, there are few people who could be talking about Myanmar with a more nuanced and informed picture. I will introduce them as they are about to speak. Let me start with Dr. Richard Horsey, to whom I will pose the first question. Dr. Horsey has been a close observer of Myanmar for the past 25 years. And any of you who are studying Myanmar, I am sure have read his brilliant work, which has covered a wide range of issues, including the illegal economies, political dimensions, but also a nuanced and granulated look at various states of conflict, including the current civil war. Since 2009, Dr. Horsey has been Myanmar advisor to the International Crisis Group. Prior to that, between 2002 and 2007, he was the Myanmar representative of the International Labour Organization, where one of the issues he focused on was forced labor by the previous regime, something that has returned, though these days is linked significantly also to Chinese criminal groups. Subsequent to his work at ILO, Dr. Horsey was a senior advisor and spokesperson for the United Nations Office of the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs following Cyclone Nargis. Richard, let me start with you, please. Can you give us a brief overview of where we are with the civil war? What are the crucial stakes? And perhaps provide an overview of the actors. I've been using terms such as resistance groups and ethnic armed organizations in my introduction, but could you please elaborate on those for our viewers today, as well as describe what kind of military tactics both the junta and the various armed groups are using? Richard, I'm not sure that...
Thank you very much, Vanda, and thank you to Brookings Institute for inviting me to speak today. I'll try to give a short overview of where things are, or where I feel things are, and touch on as many of the points in your question as possible. You know, 2 years on, more than 2 years on from the military coup, I don't think either the military regime or the resistance forces arrayed against it are where they wanted or expected to be at this point. For the military, I think there was an initial confidence that the resistance forces would quickly crumble in the face of military attacks. They felt that these were young kids who'd taken up arms without any real knowledge or understanding of what it meant to fight the Myanmar military, and they thought that they would be able to deal with them quite quickly. I think they also felt that they would be able to remove community support for these groups, again, by deploying the kind of brutal counterinsurgency tactics that have long been used in ethnic minority areas and deploying those in other areas of the country. But neither of those things have happened. The resistance remains determined, it remains tenacious, and it seems to have very strong community support as well, despite the horrific atrocities that we've seen being committed by the military. For the resistance forces, the hundreds of PDFs and local defense forces and the national unity government itself, I think there was also an initial confidence that given the widespread anger across the country at the coup, and then at the brutality of the military, that they would be successful in translating that anger quite quickly into revolutionary change. And that goal is still, it appears, some way off as well. And so I think it's the third set of actors, the ethnic armed organizations, who are also in a very important position. These groups and other ethnic forces and militias as well, most of whom have experienced this kind of situation before or something like it. I think they're the groups that have tended to be less caught off guard by events. And these different ethnic armed organizations, it's impossible to generalize. And it's also impossible in the time available to go through each and every organization and give an analysis. But by and large, these groups have taken a range of positions depending on how they've judged the best path was to pursue or make progress on their own objectives and agendas. And for some, that has meant a much more assertive posture against the regime, against the Myanmar military. We've seen that clearly with the Chin National Front, the Karenni National Progressive Party, at least one faction of the KNU, the Korean National Union as well. But for others, it's meant taking advantage of the fact that the military has been distracted by events in the center and by the political crisis and by the new conflict in the center, and use the space that that's provided to kind of spread their wings, to take over more territory, to ramp up their business activities, to take more control. Certainly that's been the case with the Arakan Army and the Ta'ang National Liberation Army as well. And I think overall, in much of the periphery of Myanmar, there's a strong sense that military authority is much less than it was, that Naypyidaw and the regime has much less ability to control or influence events in the periphery than it once did. And for some groups, that's meant that they've seen an enormous opportunity to expand their economic activities, their territory, including illicit economic actors. And so whether it's the United Wa State Army, whether it's the Lahu militias around Tachile, whether it's the Karen Border Guard Force down in Karen State, they've seen an opportunity from this situation, and they've seized it very quickly. We've seen a ramp up of the illicit economy, whether it's a huge increase in opium production, 80% or more increase since the coup, continued massive production of methamphetamine and probably an increase there as well, but also a resurgence of casino activity, the kind of scam centers that Vanda spoke of in the introduction, as well as a range of other illicit activities, rare earth mining, other kinds of mining, logging, and so on. And I think, the prognosis for the country at this point is not good, but the world, when it looks at Myanmar, I think is misdiagnosing the problem. Myanmar's neighbors are not as alarmed by events as they should be. I think they're discounting many of the longer term and medium term risks and focusing on short term situation. And I say this because, I think initially after the coup, there was a great fear in the region and beyond that the coup would produce, huge immediate impacts beyond Myanmar's borders, huge refugee flows and other situations that haven't really happened. The displacement in Myanmar is almost entirely internal, or the vast majority of displacement is internal. There hasn't been a kind of major refugee crisis. And there hasn't been a lot of fighting spilling across the borders either, which was the concern of some neighbors. And so I think they felt, well, okay, it's very bad for Myanmar, but it's not as bad as we feared for us. And that's allowed them to pursue a kind of self-serving strategy of engaging with Naypyidaw, of not really taking difficult decisions. And I think that's a little bit the sense in the world at large as well. There have been many other crises dominating the global agenda over the last couple of years, whether it's the exit from COVID, the withdrawal from Afghanistan, the situation in Tigray, and now the situation in Ukraine. And Myanmar's always been felt to be a worry, but not a first order worry in the West. It's been pushed down that agenda. And I think that's not only been very detrimental to Myanmar, it's also a strategic mistake, because I think when you step back and you look at what is happening in Myanmar, the massive growth of the illicit economy, transnational criminal organizations are voting with their feet. I was 2 weeks ago in northern Laos in the Golden Triangle Special Economic Zone there, and looking around at Tatcha Lake as well. And the increase over the last year or two in illicit activity moving from northern Laos to Tatcha Lake to other parts of Shan State and down to Shui Koko and elsewhere in Karen State. Enormous shift. The scam operators are moving a lot of their operations to Myanmar now. A lot of casino and money laundering activity is moving to Myanmar as well. And so these transnational groups who can choose, the least problematic jurisdictions for them to do their illicit activities, they're choosing Myanmar right now, and it's not difficult to understand why. So what does it mean for the region and the world to have state failure, to have state fracture in Myanmar, in a critical location of geopolitical contestation? What does it mean to have, a massive production of illicit narcotics that are being trafficked, at least across the Asia Pacific? What does it mean to have a collapse of health infrastructure, children not being routinely immunized, tuberculosis treatment, HIV, malaria treatment collapsing? These things will have enormous knock-on effects. And I think, those impacts have been discounted because they're a little bit farther off and harder to quantify. But I think what it means is that, Myanmar will continue to create problems for the region and the world. And that unless there are solutions found within Myanmar to the crisis, this is going to keep on rolling. And I think it really does require more attention from policymakers than it's had. I'll stop there.
Oh, thank you very much, Richard, for this really terrific overview. I look forward to hearing more from Yoon Soon about some of the geopolitical dimensions, and from Thinzar Shunlei Yi very soon about some of the on-the-ground pictures that you, Richard, were talking about, issues like schools and healthcare collapsing. But just very quickly, Richard, you spoke about the horrific methods that the Myanmar military has been using, and this is a similar pattern. Can you just very briefly for our viewers explain what those methods are?
I mean, basically, the Myanmar military is treating the resistance forces as insurgents, and it's deploying its counterinsurgency strategy, the four-cut strategy, which, to any people in minority areas and to the Rohingya, this is very familiar from the past. It's the kind of extremely brutal approach which focuses on removing the support that insurgent groups need to operate, and that means destroying communities, destroying food supplies, removing the possibility of getting intelligence from local people. It often implies, a lot of targeting of civilians, but also mass population displacement as well, so that insurgents don't have a civilian base that they can rely on for support, for intelligence, for recruits, and so on. And so we've been seeing this playing out. This has been playing out for decades in the mountainous upland areas, and it hasn't been reported on much. It's been, the subject of a great deal of concern, but I don't think many people in Myanmar in the cities knew very much about what was happening. When the Rohingya faced the same thing back in 2017, many people in the cities in Myanmar didn't really comprehend what was happening, I think, because they hadn't experienced this firsthand. But now, these kind of extremely brutal tactics that focus on attacking civilian populations, these are being deployed in central parts of the country that not only have no experience of this, but also don't have the coping strategies that people in minority areas who have faced this have built up over decades and generations. And so it's having an enormous impact on communities. And it's no form of warfare. It's a form of civilian targeting.
Well, very distressing picture, and as you said, very typical of what's been happening in Myanmar for decades. And I look forward to Dr. Min Zaw also elaborating about what this means for sustainability resistance. But before that, let me continue with the theme of what's happening on the ground. And I'm absolutely thrilled to have with us Ms. Thinzar Shunlei Yi, who is not only going to be very generous with her insights, but is already very generous with waking up very early to be able to do the event. So enormous gratitude for that as well. Ms. Shunlei Yi is well known around the world for her tireless activism for peace and justice in Myanmar, particularly in the ongoing civil war. From 2012 to 2016, she co-organized and led the nationwide various regional forums in Myanmar, as well as the National Youth Development Policy process. She was also the first female coordinator of the National Youth Congress and the two-term president of the Yangon Youth Network. Currently, she leads, she's an advocacy lead at the Asian Youth Peace Network, and she also works with the Action Committee for Democracy Development. In 2016, Ms. Shunlei received the US State Department Award as Emerging Young Leader, and in 2012, she also received the Women of the Future of Southeast Asia Award. And she's also one of the Obama Foundation's inaugural selected Obama leaders for Asia Pacific. Lastly, I should mention that Ms. Shunlei Yi co-founded the Under 30 TV show in Mizima TV, where she serves as the show's weekly host. Thinzar, we started talking about the burden that communities in Myanmar are bearing, having to deal both with being deprived of having their voices counted in the political process of democracy, but also now facing a very difficult civil war, and something that, of course, the ethnic minority communities really have dealt with since across much of the 20th as well as 21st century. I would love to get from the very ground perspective about what are the key concerns for people, the state of the resistance groups, the state of repression, human rights, and just the local picture.
Thank you, Professor, and thank you so much for having me today. So as a civil society actor, as an activist for human rights and democracy, after the coup, we gathered among ourselves and we formed a General Strike Committee. So as a Foreign Affairs Committee members of the General Strike Committee, I also sit in the National Unity Consultative Council in a different joint coordination committees, and at the same time as ACDD coordinator, I've been working together with the farmers worker. We are the 14 networks across the whole country, and I'm the only one outside the country as an advocacy person, so I can talk to you. So on behalf of all these coalition and ground strike members, I would like to share, before I explain what is going on the ground, we want you to know that why we are doing what we are doing. I think that's very important. So today marks 772 days since the brutal coup attempt in our country. And today in this early morning, I've waken up to honor our people by continuing to revolt against military rule in Myanmar. Every day, we must celebrate the undoubted spirits, relentless power, and brave resilience of the Myanmar people marching toward the federal democracy. So the coup attempt has awakened all of us who had almost come to accept the 2008 constitution, a constitution mainly drafted by the military and which guarantee impunity for its countless past crimes. I walk the path paved by the 2008 constitution when I began my journey as an activist. I got to know it on the ground, in the street, in parliament, discussing it on TV, campaigning against it, using it to promote electoral rights, and trying to widen its scope. I led advocacy for the first national youth policy development process in Myanmar. In 2016, I also organized the first public hearing in the parliament to remove the guest registration law, and I brought villagers, administrators, and grassroots activists to parliament to push for administrative reform. After 10 years of advocacy in the 2020 election, I couldn't help but boycott it. I boycotted it and the 2008 Constitution at its base. I did not cast my vote, and I wasn't alone. We knew too well that consequences of the path we were walking under the military roadmaps. We had a strong sense that our country should not be designed like this. And Myanmar nation building process has just started only after the people of Myanmar launched Spring Revolution, I would say. I was doubtful and suspicious with many thoughts about people commitment or passion for change because we have seen ongoing genocide in the country, and I thought nothing else could go wrong than this in this country or in the world. Now we have an opportunity to reflect our past mistakes and fix them, and then rebuild the nation, the country. So the goal of this revolution, this resistance, can no longer be the naive dream of oneness. From now on, we must appreciate Myanmar's diversity, and we must live in harmony as a federal state. We don't need to be one, just one to fight them or to fight the junta. We can be ourselves and keep our unit identities. That's who we are, and that's our strength. Myanmar's situation is not getting better as the military state resists abandoning its coup plan, clinging to hope in the 2008 Constitution. They will only help them hang on and consolidate their power. Last Saturday, the Myanmar army killed 30 civilians and 3 Buddhist men at the monastery in Nan Heng village in Pinlang Township in Shan State. Earlier that day at around 11 a.m., the army carried out airstrikes and shelling on the village where all refugees were reported to be shelling, burning down around 50 houses. The life of the refugee are also at risk. The arrest cases are also growing in India borders, in Manipur, in different states, and also in the Thailand's border, where now we are seeing more and more neighboring countries cooperating with the Myanmar junta, including India. India has been legitimizing junta since day one by sending their ambassador, also sending their arms, weapons. Even in the last phase, they've been training Myanmar Election Commission in the Myanmar junta's sham election. So in addition to abandoning 2008 Constitution, we must cut into the military revenue streams. The military has brought countless weapons with the people taxes, and they are quite resourceful with the gas and the profit they gained during the 10-year so-called democratic transition. Myanmar natural resources, also infrastructure, are now seized by the military. After committing genocide in the last 6 years against the Rohingya population, now they are committing war crimes, crimes against humanity, and massacre against every other ethnic population. And there is a call for the to stop listening to disinformation from gas company and allowing them to fund the junta and its atrocity and its war on the Myanmar people by the Myanmar civil society and advocacy groups for the sanction on MOGE, Myanmar Oil and Gas Enterprise. And they've been calling to enact sanction that divert the revenue into escrow account, and also they've been encouraging U.S. government to work together with the Thai government to ensure compliance with the sanction. At the same time, in Myanmar, inside the country, every day we have non-violent political defiance and different actions also happening in the large scale in different places in Myanmar. Civil society, like my own organization, like ACDD, they all remain inside, and they are organizing the ground to mobilize more activities and to heal the souls of the communities and the people, and to educate the communities on resilience and resistance. Ground strikes stay happening across country, and the women are fighting in the front line in the battle, also in the household against the dictatorship and patriarchy. When you can imagine when the houses are burned down, the military raid in the village, they burned down all the houses in the villages, and then people are displaced after some time, and then they came back and to rebuild their houses and restore the spaces. So this has been happening. That's why we have we are seeing internal displacement in a large scale in the country, because they keep reminding people like me and you that people belong to the country. And we are everywhere, and we are too many. And this generation is bringing change. So I will stop here, and we'll share more in the second round. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much for the very powerful comments, and also enormous kudos and admiration for the very impressive work that you and your colleagues are doing under extremely difficult circumstances. You know, you spoke about living in a federal state. That's, of course, something that has been long a difficult challenge and issue in Myanmar over many decades. And I am really delighted now to continue delving more into this aspect of the conversation with Dr. Zaw Oo. Dr. Zaw Oo is currently the executive director of the Myanmar Institute for Peace and Security, where he leads policy research and analysis. The institute has produced over 100 security assessments and publications on a wide range of issues. And I mentioned, if you study Myanmar, you have read Richards. If you study Myanmar, you have read Min. Dr. Zaw Oo also serves as a non-resident adjunct fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Security in Washington, and a global fellow at the Peace Research Institute in Oslo. Before the coup, Min played a critical role in Myanmar's peace process. He served as the executive director of the Technical Secretariat Center of the Joint Ceasefire Monitoring Committee. He was advising the peace commissions established by the NLD-led government, and also providing technical support in the negotiations of the nationwide ceasefire and the bilateral ceasefire that followed. Dr. Zaw Oo also served as the Director of Research and Monitoring and Evaluation for Democracy International project in Afghanistan, a country that too is going through a great deal of suffering currently. And he was directing a research division of a subsidiary of the US-based Ideas International. Min received his PhD from George Mason University, but in recognition of his achievements, he was also awarded a Distinguished Alumni Exemplar in 2018. Dr. Zaw Oo, can you please discuss more both of what's happening in terms of the military struggle, the issues that Thinzar so eloquently and Richard in such prescient detail were talking about, but also the challenge of the relations between the Burma resistance group and the ethnic armed organizations. I mean, currently we are in a period of perhaps unprecedented cooperation and unprecedented cooperation between the ethnic armed groups and the national unity government. But long there have been many differences, such as around the issue of federalism. What are the prospects for continuation of the cooperations or for the resurrection of conflicts and disagreements, and not simply during the military struggle, but should the junta be either defeated or should there be some sort of negotiated way out of the fighting?
Thank you, Vanda. Thank you for inviting me to talk about the current state of affair on the different groups and factions in Myanmar. And after 2021 military coup, there is a new phenomenon, which is the explosion of new armed groups. Initially, there were over 350 groups in March. But later they were consolidated into smaller number, but still in a few dozens. So it's very difficult to generalize how many types of new groups, but I try my best. There were 5 types we can usually generalize. So Burma armed groups that decided to become a part of the National Unity Government's People Defense Force or the local defense force. So that's one group. The second is the Burma armed groups. They want to stand by themselves. They don't want to be a part of the NUG Change of Command. Well, one of the well-known cases, Bonaga group in Palazagai. The third type is the ethnic minority groups. It's not just Burma forming new groups, but also many young ethnic activists also form new ethnic armed groups as well. One of the well-known is the KNDF in Kaya, and for example, in Qing state alone, there were over 20 groups. And the fourth type is the ethnic groups that join the existing EAOs, ethnic armed groups. The fifth type is the EAOs, the established EAOs, help the new groups set up as a proxy forces. Like if you're going to see the AA or MNDAA, KNU, you're going to see that very different groups, which is not under the NUG Change of Command, but they set it up under the shadow of the EAOs. So these are the 5 types of new groups you can observe after the military coup. So let me go to the relationship between the NUG and the EAOs at this point. It's a very complex and intricate relationship based on how the standing of the EAOs. One of the EAOs, most of the EAOs on the day, they want to maintain ceasefire with the military junta. So the biggest group like UWSA, NDAA, the SSPP, and some of the NCA signatories, they kept the distance from the NUG. The second type is the groups that are not fighting actively with the military, but at the same time, they are supporting some of the resistant groups or selling arms for economic reasons as well. So this is another type of group, EAOs. And the third type is EAOs actively collaborating with the NUG, the well-knowns like the CNF, KIA, KNU. Even with these groups, the NUG relationships are intricate. For example, like the KIA doesn't want the NUG to set up battalions in KIA control area. So a lot of these new fighters under the NUG association have to be part of the KIA rather than setting up a standalone battalion. So even in KNU area, KNU rather have the PDF fighters attached to the military columns under the command of the ethnic leaders rather than setting up a standalone battalions. For the reason, most of the NUG battalions exist in Sagaing and Magui rather than ethnic minority areas. And there are also other EAOs that are collaborating with the military junta. One of the EAOs like SNA, the Shani National Army, we are seeing more collaboration between them after the military coup. But there were also former ethnic armed groups that signed ceasefire, and later they were transformed into militias and border guard forces, and now they're collaborating with the military, and they are also very significant in number. Actually, very significant number is comparable to some of the fighting groups. They become the force multiplier of the military. And if we look at the landscape between these groups, even among those fighting the regime and the NUG and those newly formed armed groups, there is no significant policy difference. So all the groups accepted, okay, there's going to be a federalism in the future. But what is the predicament is the chronic factionalism rooted in countries' political culture. But the Myanmar is not the unique case. We have seen that kind of the challenges of factionalism in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, and many other weak states. But there are also other issues that can impact on the factionalism in Burma in coming years under the ethnic political parties. So many ethnic political parties will contest in the upcoming election, if it's ever held. We are start seeing a lot of preparations and registrations for the many ethnic political parties. Another issue is the friction between the NLD leadership inside the country and those in exile. That issue can play it out significantly, especially if the Aung San Suu Kyi is released. Her opinion and what is currently going on may not be in line. So that's another issue. Another issue that can impact on the federalism is influence of a neighboring country, especially China or some of the major EAOs as well. So these are the actors and issues to be considered in how they're going to play out in the course of struggle against the military rule in Myanmar. So let me stop for now. Thank you.
Excellent comments. Thank you for this really terrific nuance and granularity that's allowing us to have both the broad picture and really get some of the crucial nuance for understanding how developments are taking place and what's likely ahead. You know, you mentioned the issue that federalism is now accepted, but of course, as you pointed out, to countries like Iraq or Somalia, what the content of federalism mean is widely up for grabs. What is going to be the distribution of resources between the center and peripheries? How are local armed actors going to become police or other forces? All of those are very difficult issues in all circumstances, should we get out of the current state of fighting. And you also started talking about the role of external actors, Min, which is what I am looking forward to hearing Dr. Ms. Yoon Sun very much to elaborate. And it's really a delight to introduce my terrific Brookings colleague. I will claim Yoon as my Brookings colleague. She is a non-resident senior fellow at Brookings and was a visiting fellow at Brookings between 2011 and 2014. Her principal affiliation today is as the co-director of the East Asia program and the director of the China program at Stimson. But we like to claim Yoon as ours. Prior to that, from 2008 to 2011, Ms. Yoon Sun was based in Beijing and worked as the China analyst for the International Crisis Group. And continually today, she specializes in China's policies toward conflict countries, the developing world, and more broadly. And if you are interested in Chinese foreign policy or geopolitical issues, I am sure you are reading and closely following Yoon Sun's terrific work. Yoon, can you please elaborate on what we have started hearing from Richard and Min? What have been the reactions, posture of China, Russia, India, the United States? You know, India has adopted its typical ultra real politic, as I like to call it. But China's reaction was, for a while, more nuanced and hedged. And yet recently we see the Chinese state company resuming preliminary work on Myanmar on the railway from China to the Rakhine state, for example. That railway is a key component of the China-Myanmar economic corridor. We're starting to see more Chinese activity. Does that mean that China has decided that it's time to embrace the junta in the fighting, or is it still trying to maintain a more nuanced position? Anyway, looking forward to your thoughts on that as well as the other actors. Over to you.
Sure. Thank you, Vanda. Thank you for the invitation. It's a terrific opportunity to look at what has happened to Myanmar since the coup, and what's the regional dynamics in related to the situation in Myanmar. For all these actors that you have mentioned, I would divide them into basically three camps. So on one side of the spectrum, we do have the United States and Europe. Basically, we can characterize them as the West, who are ardently opposing the military coup and also the SAC. And the West have been calling for the restoration of the political order and the political system before the coup. And especially since the military started to adopt the scorched earth policy towards PDF and towards CDM, I think U.S. A main part of the U.S. policy is focused on the calling or the pressuring on the SAC to stop human rights abuse and stop human rights violations. And I think that particular issue has become a indispensable precondition for any improvement of relations between U.S. and Myanmar, which is a very long shot to begin with. But we are seeing a lot of actions from the U.S. in terms of pressuring. We saw the ever-growing list of the sanction against Myanmar, against the members of SEC, their family members, and their business associates. And the list is also becoming more comprehensive. And as I would say, the sanction has become a primary element of U.S. policy towards Myanmar at the current stage. U.S. has not extended the recognition of NUG, but U.S. has expressed that the sanction and the support of the people, sanction on the military and support of the people of Burma is for their struggle for the democracy, freedom, human rights. And instead, I would say that U.S. does make a distinction between NUG and the democratic movement in general, and U.S. has expressed its indisputable support for the democratic movement and democratic voices in Myanmar. But in terms of the recognition of NUG, I don't see that coming just yet. We have seen in recent months growing interaction between U.S. and NUG. NUG now has a representative office here in Washington. NUG leaders also most recently has come to visit Washington and met with a list of American senior officials. So with all that being said, official recognition of NUG is not there yet. Since the pass of the NDAA, which includes the Burma Act last year, I think the most striking or the attractive issue for the U.S. policy towards Myanmar is focused on the part of the legislation that authorizes non-lethal support for the movement against the military junta. There are debates as for who are eligible for the support and what the support actually constitutes and who will get what. I think that question is being deliberated very intensely now. My understanding is there have been a lot of requests sent to Washington and a lot of questions being asked as for what is the best deliberation or the best formulation to implement this legislation, this authorization. But I don't think that a clear answer has been produced now. On the other end of the spectrum, I would say it is Russia. That if we look at Russia's relationship with the Burmese military, since the military coup, it really has grown exponentially, both in terms of the quantity and also the quality. We're seeing a growing number of, for example, senior level visits between Myanmar and Russia. We're seeing the Russian arms sales to Myanmar reaching unprecedented level compared to before. In fact, there is this perception that Russia has overtaken China to become the largest military supporter of the, in terms of the military sales and military aid, has become the largest supporter of the Burmese military. And I think another issue that really gets on the nerves of many is the issue of nuclear cooperation between Russia and Myanmar. We know that historically there have been a lot of skepticism and suspicion about the Burmese military, the last military government trying to develop their own nuclear weapons program. Now, Rosatom, the Russian national nuclear company, has signed a intergovernmental agreement with Burma about the peaceful use of nuclear technology, and that raises a lot of questions. People wonder what is the purpose of Russia's engagement with Myanmar at this particular time. There are different theories that Russia is trying to create leverage. Russia is trying to support fellow authoritarian regimes. But I think it is quite evident that Russia is the most ardent supporter of the Burmese military at this moment. For the rest of the countries in the region, China, India, and ASEAN, well, ASEAN, if we can generalize, I would say that for all these countries, there is a large element of ambiguity in their attitude towards the military. We know that we cannot speak about ASEAN as one entity or one voice, but within ASEAN, I think the countries that have not condemned the military coup and the countries that have been ambiguous towards the SAC have raised a lot of eyebrows and attention. Especially, I would say today, I think the attitude of Thailand is becoming more and more controversial. We know that Thailand is dependent on Myanmar in terms of energy, so Thailand will oppose sanctions against, for example, MOGI, the Myanmar National Energy Company. But things are cool. I think it also needs to be recognized that along the Thai-Myanmar border, the Thai authority has allowed for a lot of the oppositions and people in exile to live there and to continue to operate there from there. But so I would say that the Thai attitude is becoming quite controversial. Within ASEAN, there are also different opinions. We know that Indonesia has been particularly critical of Myanmar, and this year Indonesia is a chair of ASEAN. But I think coming to a collective, unanimous, and actionable plan for ASEAN, that seems most would agree that would be an overestimate of what ASEAN can deliver. Last but not least, a little bit about China. China has not condemned the military government or the military coup, at least not in public. But I think there's a clear discontent and clear dissatisfaction towards the internal chaos and instability in Myanmar. And I would say that under these circumstances, Myanmar is becoming a source of instability for China. Because remember, China just had 3 years of COVID lockdown, right? They basically built a wall along the border to prevent Burmese nationals from coming in. But now China has reopened, which means that the porous border is going to, the same situation that we had in the past is going to resume. And under the current unstable situation in Myanmar, it is really a big question as for how much the Chinese desired investment plan can transpire safely, especially for things like the railway that they're trying to build. If they go through, for example, the ethnic controlled area, you have to ask that, well, what is the safety or security risk related to those? China has not accepted NUG, but there are engagement on technical level. And what I mean by technical is that for areas where China have investment and have assets, the Chinese government, well, depending on which level we're talking about, have maintained engagement or interaction with NUG and PDF for those at these locales in order to ensure the safety of Chinese assets. The lockdown in China for the past few years also has had a major impact over China's diplomacy on the issue of Myanmar, because there was no travel. So it was extremely difficult for Chinese diplomats and Chinese special envoy to visit Myanmar and to conduct their shuttle diplomacy in the region. But we know that since China has reopened late last year, China has vowed to enhance its diplomatic engagement and diplomatic activities this year. In fact, if you look at the government budget that just came out last week from Beijing, the budget for diplomatic expenditure increased by 12% this year. And I think that really suggests the Chinese are gearing up towards more diplomatic engagement and activities, and that includes the issue of Myanmar. The newly appointed Chinese special envoy for Myanmar, since his appointment in late last year, he has already visited Myanmar twice and visited the border region twice, which is I would say a frequency that is unprecedented since China created the position of the special envoy for Asian affairs 10 years ago. And also, since last Friday, the world has been shocked by this Beijing brokered peace deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran. I think that also alludes to the direction that China wants to push under the framework of global security initiative, that China wants to be a leader in terms of peacemaking and in terms of conflict resolution. So I think there's definitely going to be more actions on Myanmar from China this year. Last but not least, I just want to echo something that Richard said, which is eventually what happens in Myanmar depends on the internal development, depends on the internal dynamics. I would say a lot of these regional players, China included, they are watching very closely the power struggle or the battlefield development between the NUG, between the resistance and the SAC. And the result of that military struggle will vary to a large extent to determine where China will stand. And I would say that it will also decide where India will stand, where the regional countries will stand. So eventually the core of the solution to the Myanmar problem still comes from within. We cannot rely or expect that the regional countries to determine the future of the country for Myanmar, or expect that their actions to somehow dramatically or deterministically change the situation within the country. So eventually this is a domestic politics driven regional diplomacy or regional alignment. It's not the other way around. Thank you.
It's actually a perfect transition, Ms. Sun, to what I want to be a lightning round going for all of our speakers, namely, what is the way out of the conflict? 3 years, 5 years, a decade from now, are we looking at military victory by one side? Are we looking at a very protracted conflict without a visible way out? Can there be some negotiated transition? All of you have outlined a very complex international picture, highly divided international picture, a very complex domestic picture, and a great deal of suffering. And just a side note on China, of course, China knows Myanmar very well, intimately, and has been long deeply involved in managing conflict, brokering conflict management in Myanmar in a way that China does not have at all in the Middle East, and where in the Middle East it was able to gain a big diplomatic PR win in the Saudi-Iran detente. The content of that deal is actually very weak, but it might be quite different in Myanmar. Anyway, Richard, let me go in the order that I started to you in a very quick lightning round, your thoughts on what is the way out, but also key policy recommendations. And after this lightning round, I will go to questions from the audience that we are receiving both live and received already earlier in writing. Richard.
Thanks, Vanda. In terms of the way out, I mean, I think a military defeat by one side or the other is extremely unlikely. And I think the resistance forces also recognize that. They're not fighting to take over Naypyidaw and defeat the Myanmar military on the battlefield. They're creating space where they hope something else can happen, where the military will split or the military will be catastrophically weakened by other events, an economic crisis, something else. The problem is that's a hope, it's not a plan, right? I think the military on its side remains determined to hang on. The costs for the military of failure are extremely high, personally, for the people who led this coup and for the military as an institution. So the military is not going to back down, but neither are the resistance forces. And so I think we're in a kind of crisis mode until something happens to change that, and what that might be, I think, is unclear. But this isn't a kind of frozen conflict. This is a conflict that has enormous daily implications on people across the country. And it's a conflict in which other actors, militias, transnational criminal organizations, and some states, to be very frank, are taking advantage of the chaos to pursue their own agendas. So this is not a frozen conflict. It's not something that can be safely ignored. It's not that the outside world can determine events on the ground, as Jönsson very, very eloquently said, but there are policy levers that can be pulled to mitigate some of the worst impacts on ordinary people and on some of the transnational implications as well. And I think that's where we should be looking, not to solve the crisis. I think that there are no easy solutions. And my fear is that faced with a situation which doesn't have an obvious solution, and faced with a situation where outside influence is frankly quite limited, the policymakers tend to turn away, put it at the bottom of the pile, and go on to other issues where they may feel that their actions can have more impact. And that's very dangerous. It leads to donor fatigue in terms of humanitarian support for people in Myanmar, for the Rohingya in Bangladesh. It means that there isn't a kind of active watching of the diplomatic environment to seize on opportunities, that people get stuck in grooves, salami slices of more sanctions from the West, continued subpar performance from the region in thinking through this. And we can't allow ourselves to be stuck in those grooves. I think, there needs to be more more innovative thinking, and at least at a minimum help to support the population of the country.
Thank you, Richard. And the issue of complexity and protracted conflict is even more magnified by very different US policy agenda, which no longer wants to be doing state building, stabilization, and instead is really directed toward the Asia Pacific and competition with China there and Ukraine. But with this geostrategic context, Thinzar, what is the view of you, your fellow activists, your fellow resistance activists on how do we get out of the situation?
Thank you, Vanda, and for all of your comments in the first round as well. So as a young generations, and as a woman, I've been, since the revolution started, now evolved into more full-blown revolution. It was not just anti-coup resistance. It was not just protest somewhere there. It's now turning into revolution. When we talk about revolution, that means we are changing the system, political system. When we talk about revolution, when we name it as a revolution, it's not just armed resistance. It's also political resistance. It's also ideological resistance, ideological revolution. So we are looking into changing people's mindset out of this struggle. And this is already happening. And that's what we think, take to 2 years onwards, we have gained a lot on the way in the process compared to what we have gained in the past 10 years in terms of political advancement, not in terms of economic benefits. That's what I think I'm stay hopeful with what we have right now. For example, Federal Democracy Charter is no more 2000 Constitution. Federal Democracy Charter or NUCC or NUG, it was the first ever dialogue ever happened between different ethnic groups, between different political stakeholders, without military shadow, without military participation. It's the first ever political dialogue ever happened. So people say dialogues not happening in the country. No, that's wrong. We have meetings almost every day between different ethnic groups, between different actors. We're talking directly as a young, non-violent civil society actor. I can talk directly to the ethnic arms revolution leader. I can talk directly to the people on the ground or people. This has never happened in the country. So I think we should keep up doing this, get used to it, and be okay with different views and different visions. We have different takes. It has been 7 decades long struggle, and there is a mistrust between different actors, and all because the military rule was sustained in the past 3 decades, 7 decades. But now, for the first time in the country, that kind of political opportunity happened. We can say it's window period where we are shaping our own nation. So I think this is the way forward. It's already there. The political roadmap of the Myanmar resistance is, it has 12 steps and it's already on 6 steps. It's already on the way, in the middle way. So we just have to keep going forward. And this revolution is not just about people, and we are also including the voices of the defectors, including the voices of the soldiers, not just outside, but also inside. The revolutions now listened to the people inside the military institution as well. We are listening to the wife. We are listening to their generation. What do they want? Because the future we are building right now is for everyone, including all these soldiers and their generations too. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you very much, Min. Over to you. What's the way out? How do we sustain the spirit of participation and accountability that people like Thinzar are so fearlessly promoting?
Yeah, the revolution of the 2021 have waken up young generations throughout the country, and also the armed revolution. But at the same time, the country has created 2 pockets of islands when it comes to the resistant, the nature resistant and also the conflict dynamics. For example, if you go look at places like Yangon, Mandalay, and these areas where there were like a number of nightclubs open in Yangon double after the military coup, and also the OPEC. So at the same time, the places like Sagaing, there were people losing their houses, and their houses burned down, people were running, and people cannot go to schools. So this conflict would definitely create a very dynamic and very contrasting socioeconomic situation depending on where people live in the country. In terms of armed conflict, which is about to reach its equilibrium, especially the military is now launching a new offensive. And after that dry season, we may be able to see a new equilibrium. For the anti-junta resistant forces to change the equilibrium in their favor, they need to address 4 issues. One is the weapon supply, which is still in major need, and the coordination and unity with the EAOs. That is still a lot of work to be done. And the change of command, I also addressed this issue in my presentation, and also support from the neighboring countries. So these 4 issues are very critical for them to change the equilibrium. Without this, it will be very difficult to turn the tide against the military. And also for the elections, the military is sending a very mixed signals about the elections. Some rumors say they may extend it. Some say we are also seeing some evidence of the elections. But elections will not change the current political crisis and will not resolve the current political crisis. But what the election could happen is, election could introduce a new political space and bring new actors into the playing field, such as ethnic political parties and some of the pro-democracy groups inside the country, to the new actors coming into the new playing field. But other than that, election will not able to resolve the current crisis, and the conflict will remain frozen and could be protracted for another, I would say, about 10 years. Thank you.
I mean, certainly protracted conflict, hot protracted conflict, I think is what the picture appears right now, a very difficult picture for people who have to live with it, and complex picture for the international environment, or for the international community, rather. In the spirit of being able to take as many questions from the audience in the remaining 22 minutes that we have, let me pick questions and direct them to a particular panelist. Please let me know if there are some strong points that you particularly want to come on. But let me start with maybe you, Dr. Zaw Oo, and also you, Dr. Horsey. One of the questions we received is, what keeps the Myanmar military cohesive? Despite the losses and being stretched thin, the viewer asks, we have not seen many mass desertions. We have seen some, but we have not seen mass desertions, despite a wide base of popular support for the democracy movement. Your thoughts, please. Maybe Min, I'll start with you, and then I go to Richard.
I will say that is strongly linked to how Myanmar military is formed at the unit level. For example, a lot of battalions in the Myanmar military, a lot of these soldiers, except the officer, rarely rotate. So a lot of these soldiers, they are in particular unit for many long years. So that creates some extent of brotherhood. So they may not like the leaders, they may not like the senior general, they may not like the system, but when it comes to the unit cohesion, the military is still one piece as a fighting force because of the small unit cohesion. So that was the one of my observation. That's a reason. That's why we don't see a unilever defection up to this point.
And I think the other factor is that the senior command of the military doesn't have a lot of concern for the circumstances in which its troops are fighting. There are some militaries where a large body count, where very difficult supplies would create enormous pressure, both within the military as an institution and within the wider support base, the wider social circles. That's not the case with the Myanmar military. I think the high levels of injuries, of deaths, the very difficult logistical problems that the military is facing on the ground level, these don't impinge on the high command. They don't feel that this is their problem. This is for junior and mid-level commanders to deal with. And so however many soldiers get killed, I don't think that really impacts in Naypyidaw, in the War Office, their feeling. Just as the Russian military has shown it's willing to throw thousands of soldiers into Ukraine and absorb huge losses without that causing a change of heart at the top, I think the Myanmar military is also willing, not only now, but throughout history, to put its soldiers in harm's way, to accept a high level of attrition, casualties, and still just continue on.
A brutal picture. Thinzar, let me direct this question to you, please. One of our viewers is asking, how can support be best directed to civil society organizations in Myanmar? And how can the pitfalls for international actors be managed to avoid providing material assistance to resistance groups, which could put external actors in sensitive issues related to money laundering or providing material support? The Myanmar government has been calling for designating many of the armed groups terrorist groups. That's obviously absurd, and the West hasn't done that. Nonetheless, there are significant sensitivities about material support issues and financial transfer issues. Your thoughts, please, on how best, what are the best mechanisms to support civil society groups in Myanmar?
Thank you for this question. It's very important. And that's also many civil society inside the country also like you to know that they are still working on the ground, but maybe different identities. They are now low profile. Now they are changing their names, their way of acting on the ground. But I assure you that there are so many civil society still remain on the ground and they are operating in their own ways. And Myanmar is known as there are different way of working things on the ground. For sure, the human rights organizations and resistance-related civil society organization can remain inside country. For example, media and leading activist groups, they can't remain inside the country because they were so bold in the past 10 years, their names already there. But there's so many different charity groups, blood donation, different single mom house, all these service provider remain inside. And now their political, I would say, understanding is now getting higher. That means they are making sure the delivery of aids go directly to the people. And now we are seeing that there are different reports when the military weaponize the aids and also military confiscate the aids when the aids are sent through them. So what we've been advising is there are many civil society inside country. So talk to the civil society directly, how you can deliver effectively, and also talk to the civil society along the borders. There's so many border groups. Since long time ago, they have a tremendous experiences and on-ground memories of how they could work. And now they are now operating in a large scale. So cross-border aids are really important. And still, so we need to advocate Thai government, India government to allow these cross-border humanitarian aids to go directly to the impacted communities. And at the same time, there's so many concerns from the different diplomatic community, how we can avoid, from the weaponizing of these aids from both sides and stuff. So I would say in the resistance group or in the revolution, these cross-border civil society, they work with principle. They work with, they may be Korean group, they may be Kachin group, but they are different civil society like Korean women organization, Korean human rights groups, where they make sure that deliveries or aids are going directly to the impacted civil society. You know, we can't just generalize the Korean people are just all about like the resistance or the M pillar. No, there are many humanitarian and civil society, even in the one ethnic groups, they work differently. So I think that's how now people are being delivering aids, like informally for the right now. But if the government change the policy, then it's easier, especially pressuring the neighboring countries, Thailand and India. So it will get easier. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Thinzar, for this thoughtful and detailed response. Yoon, let me direct this question to you. One of our viewers is asking, what dangers do armed resistance groups pose to neighboring countries, or will they pose if the National Unity Government and its allies win the civil war? Now, we have heard that there are no prospects for winning the civil war right now. And we also heard Richard's opening comment that neighboring countries were at first afraid of both refugee flows across the borders and conflicts spilling across the borders. That hasn't happened up till now. But are there some blowback risks? Should neighboring countries be concerned about either the armed resistance groups and ethnic armed organizations, or frankly, about the continuation of the conflict?
That's a great question, Vanda, and I really find this question to be deserving more exploration and more investigation, because I think people tend to generalize, right? And just like Thinzar just said, well, you cannot just generalize because every group is different and every border is different. I think the Indian concern, for example, about the Indian Northeast potential riot and their collaboration or their relationship with the Burmese ethnic armed groups is quite different, honestly, from the Thai concern about instability and about the inflow and outflow of basically the transborder crimes and transborder mobility issue. And I think across the board, given the question about the financial revenue of these organizations and to what extent that they do rely or at least draw some of their revenue from illicit activities, it also is a main concern for all the neighboring countries, because this is an area that Vanda, you specialize on in terms of the illegal activities to fund the military campaigns and military operations. So no matter what we say, there is going to be that spillover risk of internal instability in Myanmar. There have not been this major outflow of refugees from Myanmar to neighboring countries I would say just yet. But I don't think that is a permanent conclusion moving from now on. Especially, I think for the Chinese, when they look at their border, the refugee inflow after the 2009 Kokang incident, that was 37,000 people. And then after the 2015, again, the Kokang conflict, that's another tens of thousands of refugees into China. So depending on where the armed conflict is going to intensify, I wouldn't say that the potential for refugee outflow is completely off the table. And last but not least, I think this is another area that makes the Chinese position really interesting, which is, well, they do have concerns about ethnic armed groups on their border working with what they believe working with Americans or working with Westerners, like Europeans even included. So there is a perception that, for example, Kachin is willing to introduce foreign Western influence into this region on China's border, and it is a pretty, I would say, a pretty good critical concern coming to China's policy towards Myanmar, because eventually there is a very strong element of prevention of Western influence to come to this area and especially come to China's border with the potential to affect China's border stability. So that's another, I would say that is a distinct concern for China. And it does affect China's attitude towards these groups. So I will stop there. Thank you.
Well, let me actually continue, Yunsun, on the theme of China, and then welcome everyone else to chime in on that. You know, China's policy has certainly been very preoccupied with keeping the West out. I remember 10 years ago, a Chinese diplomat telling me as the country was opening, quote, that the United States stole Myanmar from China. Of course, Myanmar is no one's to steal, it's his own country, and the characterization was fraught with many problems. At the same time, even the previous government, the NLD government, had very strong relationship with China. Aung San Suu Kyi's first visit as the State Council was to China. So two questions for everyone, starting with you, Yoon. What is the relationship right now between the National Unity Government and Beijing like? What can we say about that? And second, you know, we have been talking about the protracted conflict, but in this case, unlike in Ukraine, it is not in China's interest to have a protracted conflict going on. In Ukraine, China might be quite happy to keep Russia just alive, not to be defeated, to detract the West's attention from solely the Indo-Pacific. But in Myanmar, vital economic resources are at stake, major projects, that is the issue of ethnic groups, refugees. China would be much better off if the conflict came to an end. How does China navigate that? Yoon, perhaps starting with you, then I can go to Min, Thinzar, and Richard.
Sure, thank you. I think there are two questions. One, how does China potentially will do anything to stop this conflict, because it is in China's interest. And I think the Chinese, well, here's the thing, just like the Ukraine conflict, I think the Chinese wanted to end, but if you ask China to use this critical influence over Russia to bring the war to an end, I don't think China is willing to disperse that resources or that influence. Meaning that, well, if there is peace and it doesn't cost China anything, great, but if it's going to cost China the significant relationship that it has with Russia, well, I think China's top security concerns still remains the geopolitics, which is the United States, and Russia is still seen as a partner in that campaign. But so coming back to Myanmar, we have seen this this instability protract in Myanmar for, I would say, decades. And sometimes, unfortunately, this facilitates a policy inertia in China, like, oh, Myanmar is in chaos, what's the news? So I think because of the fact that China has been living with a Myanmar in a civil war for 7+ decades, there is a sense of normalcy, unfortunately. But of course, many would say that, oh, what is happening now is entirely different. It's entirely different from before, because now the young people, the young generation, the public opinion has completely changed from before. But I don't think that has created a critical impact on China's policy just yet. Meaning that, well, by the end of the day, the Chinese will say this is not our territory, and as long as we can protect our border, it's not a bottom line issue for China that China has to address. Does it want it to be addressed? Sure, but if China has to use its critical policy leverage and influence to make it happen, I just don't think that fits the pattern of China's policy. Second question is China's relationship with NUG. I think there has been the hope from the resistance that if China could adopt a more receptive and open and welcoming attitude towards the resistance, then that's going to sway the dynamics on the battlefield or the political dynamics in the country. I think that goes back to my comment earlier that eventually China's attitude is dependent on the internal development. It's not the other way around. I don't think the Chinese will be willing to use this influence to sway the politics in one way or the other. Because for China, I've talked about this before, I think the Chinese also see that NUG's legitimacy as a question. That we know that NUG's legitimacy came from the CRPH, but the Chinese will say, well, CRPH was created by this handful of legislators, MPs elected in 2020 election. Well, if you look at the whole Ludol, there are more than 600 of MPs. So what is representativeness of the CRPH to represent the whole Ludol to begin with? So that's a different question. But I think for China, if NUG is going to prevail, I think the Chinese will be willing and happy to work with NUG, just like they were happy and willing to work with NLD. It's not about an attachment to the military junta at all. It's more about a practical and realistic acceptance of the political reality in the country. And in the Chinese view, I'm afraid to say this, the military is still regarded as the dominating force in the country. And this stalemate does not seem to have a rapid ending in sight. Thank you.
Min, Thinzar, and Richard, we are 4 or 5 minutes away from having to end. So also please use this last opportunity in 2 minutes to make any other points beyond the China issues that I raised. Min, over to you, please.
Yeah, I would like to talk about the beyond China because it is critical that the civil society need to survive inside the country. You know, despite the revolution, despite other people joining the armed revolution, the civil society is still there. These civil society need to survive because we can't wait until everything is resolved to reenact the civil society. So this is something international community should pay attention, that there are still non-violent activists inside the country. There are still pro-democracy political parties still there, pro-democracy ethnic parties still there. They are also waiting for the opportunities to enhance the interest on this federalism and democratic issues. So this is an issue we also should pay attention and support these groups inside the country.
Thank you, terrific. Thinzar, please, your concluding thoughts.
Thank you. So when we talk about Myanmar's issue, Myanmar's problems, you know, impacting across our neighbor, also in the region, we must think of the root cause of the problems. For example, we had a 2008 constitution. We thought it was a political transitions toward a better Myanmar, peaceful Myanmar, but we shouldn't forget that we had a continued civil war. I was even protesting against the civil war within that 10-year long period. And we even had a genocide against Rohingya out of this whole scenario. So we must reflect now, like, what is the real political realities in the country? What should be this in the very beginning? So now the answer is federal democracy that people been asking, people been demanding in a large scale right now. So at the same time, there is a big questions about who is the dominant factor in the country, who is influencing the whole Myanmar political sector. I would say military, of course, state control many different infrastructure, but that does not mean that they are in power. I mean, they may be in power because the power, people may interpret the power come from the barrels of guns. But in the long term, the generations seeing things, the power come from people itself. The power comes from the resistance, power comes from the revolution. So we should think of next 20 years, what the current generations are thinking right now and how it will shape the next 20 years. And I think that will give you more answer on the way you think of Myanmar. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very powerful words. Richard, your concluding thoughts, please.
Thanks. I want to come back to something that Zaw Oo said, and one of his 4 criteria for resistance success, which was support from neighbors or a neighbor. And I think that has to be thought about as well politically by the National Unity Government. I mean, it's great that they've formally opened an office in Washington, but as you pointed out, Vanda, it's not that we're not living in a world, we're not living in an era where the US is willing or capable to determine outcomes in countries far away, particularly countries neighboring China. And I think the last thing we want is Myanmar to be pulled into the geopolitical rivalry between the US and China. It hasn't been pulled into that particularly so far. That's a worst case scenario for Myanmar. So really the NUG needs to be focusing its efforts on convincing countries in the region that it is someone they can deal with and improving that diplomacy. It's been tried. It's been trying really hard. That's a very hard nut to crack. But focusing efforts on the West can make the regional piece harder to solve, I think. Because when China is sitting on the fence in this situation, it's not because it's unsure who it wants to back or who's going to win, I think. It sees the NUG primarily as a Western-leaning milk tea alliance supporting organization and the broader resistance in that light. And that's not a very comfortable entity for China to feel that it wants to engage with, or that it feels that it wants to take control of Myanmar. When it looks at the Myanmar military, it also sees a group of generals who've been always intensely suspicious of China and who've really messed up what China felt was the golden period under the NLD and Aung San Suu Kyi. And so that's why they're sitting on the fence, but they can't sit on the fence forever. I think the extension of the state of emergency, the postponement of the elections, has meant that China can't afford to wait until there's a new political dispensation post-elections and engage with a post-regime military structure. I think it feels it has to start thinking now about which way it goes. And so now is the moment where I think the NUG has to be working the hardest to convince China and other neighbors that, we can do business. We're not a puppet of the West. We're not an organization that's been captured by the West, and that's the real priority, I think, right now.
Oh, thank you very much, Dr. Horsey, Dr. Zaw Oo, Ms. Shunlei Yi, and Ms. Sun, for your very informed, very nuanced, very detailed comments. Enormous thanks for spending the time with us today. Very particular thanks again for Thinzar to joining us very early, but also for all of your commitment to Myanmar and all of your efforts to ease the suffering that people there are experiencing. Enormous thanks to all of our viewers. The event will stay recorded on the Brookings website. Feel free to continue going back to the video. And thank you very much for joining the initiative on Nonstate Armed Actors program. Our next event will be on the Wagner Group in Ukraine, in Africa, and beyond. And I hope that some of you can join. We will certainly continue being focused and engaged on Myanmar and many of the issues that we have raised.
Thank you.